Well, not necessarily what the Communist Party of China wanted us to take away from it. The Communist Party view was that there would be possibly 5% growth in GDP in 2023, that there would be a 7.2% increase in defense spending, and that the economy was moving back into, shall we say, pre-pandemic levels of growth and employment and the like. I think none of these factors should be taken at, or claims should be taken at face value. Firstly, any economic growth which the Communist Party is expecting or is claiming it will achieve this year is going to be based on massive injections of debt. They're going to have to borrow money to basically fund all forms of growth. There's no evidence that the private sector itself is stimulating growth or that there is a growth in consumer demand. Quite the contrary. People are very, very gun-shy after the events of the last couple of years and are not spending in the way in which the Communist Party had projected. So the stimulation of the economy is going to come by more debt money flowing into the economy for various projects. Nonetheless, the major sectors of the economy, and particularly the property sector, looks unlikely to revive. At best, the Communist Party will be able to get a softer landing. But what we saw from all of the indicators was something which we predicted, and I think we predicted it on your show a couple of years ago, was the fact that the Communist Party is moving under Xi's direction back into that approach, which would be a circular economy or an internal circulation economy. In other words, China, under the Communist Party, now hopes that its internal marketplace will be enough to stimulate economic growth and operations, because its exports have plummeted, its imports are going to be restricted, and so now it must rely on stimulating that internal market. And there's no evidence that it can do that, but its best hope for survival economically and strategically is that it does develop an internal circulation market. It was in July 2021 that we talked about this as looking like where she was going with the economy. Now, the problem with that is that the People's Republic of China still cannot avoid the massive cost of importing food. It is, as we've said on many occasions, it's existentially dependent on imported food to a greater degree than any historical empire since the collapse of Rome. So it needs that food mainly from the United States, but also from Europe, Australia, Brazil, and the like, but particularly from the United States. So it's still going to have to import food. So it can't rely entirely on its internal economy. GDP growth, you can claim what you like on that. GDP, gross domestic product, is a measure of the economy, but it's only a measure really of transactions within the economy. So you can create artificial transactions to show GDP growth, but it doesn't mean you're gaining in economic strength. So China is basically in a very, very weak economic position. It's still going to have to spend a lot of its hard-earned foreign exchanges currency on food and energy. It's been very fortunate because the Ukraine war meant that Russia has lost a lot of its markets and is now being forced, in a sense, to sell energy and food to the People's Republic of China at bargain basement prices. So this is going to help Xi Jinping, but it's not going to be enough. Now, of course, they moved to the defense expenditure, increasing it by 7.2%, and that's very substantial. The reality is that we don't know what the total defense spending is by the People's Republic of China. It's certainly much more than the official headline figures, which are going to be about $225 billion this year. It could be as much as double that. And what China's, or the People's Republic of China's, aggression has done in the last year or so has been to panic its neighbors, particularly Japan, Vietnam, and India, to the point where they are increasing their defense spending. And that, of course, is having yet another reactive effect on Beijing, which feels that it has to move even more rapidly on defense spending. This is not really helping the Chinese economy. So essentially, what we've seen with the two sessions is the Communist Party trying to put a positive spin on matters. They're saying, yes, growth is going to be lower than we wanted, but it's still going to be 5%. We are going to get massive employment. We are going to have an internal marketplace which will stimulate industrial growth and the like. But all of these things are very, very speculative, very, very fragile, and we're not seeing the internal conditions moving in the right direction to improve food production or, in fact, the confidence of the public in spending money.
It does seem, Xi Jinping tapped for mentally the country's economy, and they're seen as loyalists. They've never studied abroad. So there is concern, especially with foreign investors, on how that's going to impact, say, investing in the country. And we did have, say, the billionaire Mobius coming out and saying he's having trouble removing money from the country. And even some Chinese nationals living abroad are running into that. So how do you see that front maybe changing or staying the same going forward?
Well, Xi Jinping is going to have to do a lot to restore confidence from the foreign investing community. As you say, there's difficulty in getting money out of the PRC economy to repatriate funds from foreign investors. There's difficulty in Chinese individuals being able to move currencies abroad, although people are still attempting to do that in a desperate way. So what you've got are a lot of foreign major investors in the PRC who are staring at the reality that they may never get their funds out of the PRC, in much the same way as those people who invested in the railway bonds during the Qing dynasty have not yet been able to get their money back from the Chinese government. So what these major foreign firms are now having to do is to nominally appear to support the fiction that there is a Chinese mainland economic resurgence underway, and to a degree there is. But it's a small, modest rise from a very, very deep base caused by the whole pandemic situation and the zero COVID lockdowns. So yes, there are some indicators which foreign companies are clinging to so that it doesn't appear to their shareholders that they have lost all of their investment money, whether it's pension funds or investment fund allocations. So there's a global fiction abroad at the moment, which is that the economy in the People's Republic of China is in for a soft landing. It's not going to be that soft. It's going to be one which has worldwide ramifications, because it will cut into the pension funds, particularly of people around the world, but particularly retirees in the United States.
And Gregory, sticking with the speech, it seems China's Xi Jinping for the first time took direct aim at the United States. He was calling Washington-led containment, encirclement, and suppression for the country's internal issues. So is this just talk, or is China actually gearing up for something?
Well, there's no question that a lot of the masks are coming off, both in Washington and in Beijing. There's no question that Beijing cannot anymore ignore the reality that the United States has put itself in a very strong position by limiting computer chip production and availability for the People's Republic of China. And Beijing will have to do something about that. The question is what it can do. There's been a lot of talk about the feasibility of a breakout military action against the West, largely by an invasion of Taiwan by the People's Liberation Army. That has been the cause for a lot of wargaming exercises to take place in the West to see whether that would be feasible. It certainly would be a very risky affair for Beijing to undertake, and as a result, Beijing knows that if it attempts anything like that, it would have to confront Vietnam and India, as well as Taiwan, Japan, the United States, and Australia, in particular those countries. So the People's Republic of China has been looking at options as to what its breakout could look like, what their options are in, if you like, defeating the West. Because, again, as we said a few years ago, Xi Jinping has realized that his ability to outgrow the West, and particularly the United States, to outgrow it economically and strategically is now very, very difficult. So he must resort to undermining the economic and strategic base of his adversaries, particularly the United States. So the view is if China cannot grow strategically enough to defeat the West, then the West must be reduced by indirect means, economically, politically, and so on, so that the West becomes economically deprived and politically unstable. And so that's really the very, very poor option base which Xi Jinping has available to him.
That was Gregory Copley, president of the International Strategic Studies Association. And after a break, we hear more from him on how China's defense spending increases have put neighboring countries on high alert, what activities we're seeing inside China, and where all of this might lead. That and more in just a minute here on China in Focus. Welcome back to China in Focus. I'm Tiffany Meyer. We continue our coverage with Gregory Copley, president of the International Strategic Studies Association. He sheds light on how China's defense spending increases have put neighboring countries on high alert, what activities we're seeing inside China, and where all of this might lead. Where do you see the trajectory of the U.S.-China relation going forward? What are maybe the changes that might happen?
Well, even the U.S. Biden administration, which was very, very accommodating to Beijing, was hopeful of a rapprochement, hopeful that there could be a restoration of the status quo ante, in other words, before President Trump came on the scene, and to see the U.S. and the PRC as, in a sense, partners. That's now fallen away. President Biden, although he is as moderate as he can be in terms of his discussion of the PRC, has nonetheless allowed his administration to take very, very strong action to curb the rise of the PRC. So it's no surprise now that Xi Jinping and the Communist Party of China are coming out with stronger and stronger statements. The question as to where this can lead is anyone's guess. The reality is that if logic prevails, then it will not break into open conflict, because it's clear that although everyone would suffer, the Communist Party of China would be destroyed by such a major breakout, such as an attack on Taiwan, which would result in a broader war. So anything like that would have to be a very desperate act on the part of Xi Jinping. So what then are his options? The primary option is bluster. We saw it in the earlier version as wolf warrior diplomacy, where you would attempt to browbeat your adversaries around the world and make them feel as though they had to comply with Beijing's wishes. That bluff has been called, and a lot of countries, take for example Australia, which had been very, very pro-Beijing, but would not back down when Beijing attempted to coerce it with this bullying diplomatic rhetoric. So the bluff of Beijing has been called to a large degree. We're seeing even the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, which should be confined to the western of the Eurasian continent. They're talking about strategies to assist in the containment of the People's Republic of China. Not that that's even necessary at this stage, because the Quad powers, the AUKUS combine, and ANZUS, the Australian, New Zealand, US treaty, all of those are well and truly sufficient to contain the PRC militarily, even with the PRC now planning on multiple front options. Would it conduct a simultaneous military operation against Taiwan, Vietnam, and India, knowing that this would lead to a further expansion, engaging Japan, Australia, and the United States? It's not a good outlook for the Communist Party of China at this stage. The question is, how and when does the Communist Party of China implode?
Gregory, earlier you mentioned with, say, China's own defense spending increases, a lot of neighboring countries are also reacting. And it seems inside China, we have local media reporting saying that, there's these defense mobilization offices being set up across the country. In Xiamen, which is the closest one to Taiwan, there's this emergency alert system to tell people where to go to bunkers in case there is an invasion. Where do you see this going, and how should the U.S. be responding right now?
Well, the great fear, of course, is that Xi Jinping will recognize that the longer he waits, the more Taiwan and its allies will be prepared to meet a mainland invasion. So he could be tempted to move sooner rather than later. Not that the signs of success for that are positive either, but he runs the risk of talking himself into doing something because of these mobilization and so on. We've seen mobilizations of various types in the past on the mainland, largely when the government needs to, or the Communist Party needs a scapegoat. So you'd have all these massive panics about Japan and so on, and anger at Japan. And so you look at ways of blaming the outside world for internal problems. The danger is that this could get out of hand. There's also the probability that a lot of people within the PLA leadership, the People's Liberation Army leadership, would be very, very anxious if Xi Jinping tried to take an overseas initiative such as one against Vietnam or Taiwan or India. That's really something that the PLA, I think, does not feel ready for right now. So but it is an unstable situation, largely because power is concentrated in the hands, more or less, of a single leader, which is something that Xi Jinping wanted. He wanted to eliminate all of his rivals. Now, however, he has no flexibility, no fluidity, no depth, if you like, in the leadership structure. So it becomes unstable. The question is, what can he do to recover? And as we said a couple of years ago and again today, reviving the economy through reviving the internal market is going to be his primary drive. He will start to increasingly blame the United States and other outside forces for China's woes, which will account, if you like, for the fact that the standard of living and even the food supply to the Chinese population is declining. Now, he will, I think, we will see a great decline in the standard of living and even the survival levels of great numbers of people in China. Xi Jinping will blame that on outside forces, and he's already started to do so with his rhetoric at the two sessions, or the party's rhetoric at the two sessions, blaming the United States for the problems and the like. So finding someone to blame is key. What you do about it is another matter altogether. But Xi Jinping, I think, is prepared to see large sections of the Chinese population suffer and perhaps even starve, just as Mao Zedong did. So we have to expect that, and that's going to cause major problems for the world, even if it doesn't result in the PLA being used to start another war.
A situation which remains extremely flexible, which is the Ukraine war. So the energy pressure on energy prices has eased in the last few weeks and months because it looks like the Ukraine war is now in for a longer haul. It's not as unstable a situation as it seemed at the start, which created all the energy crisis. But it wouldn't take a lot, as we know. If Putin was to suddenly use a tactical nuclear weapon, as he keeps threatening to, for example, what impact would that have on the global economy, on energy prices and so on? So I think it is actually a lot more unstable than people think. That's why I think you're seeing the markets very schizophrenic. They're up and down and up and down, up and down. Nobody's really quite sure what to make of this. So I think it's very hard to predict. I mean, all the ones who are paid to predict these things have been made to look a bit stupid in the last few years. So I think it's hard to predict. But it really depends, I think, on certain big things from the UK point of view. One, can Brexit be made to work? And I think that's a massive if. There's no sign of it so far. Secondly, what will happen with Ukraine? Because that is really dictating a lot of the pressure which is on many countries now. Not the United States, actually, because you're not as dependent, of course, on energy as other countries. But look at Germany, who were warned repeatedly by Donald Trump to their face in video clips you can see online. He warned them, your reliance on Russian energy is madness. And they all ignored him. And now look, he was right.
Yeah, between that and all of Europe deciding to listen to the ramblings of a Swedish teenager about energy policy, it turns out that you're going to cut yourself off from your economic base. This does raise the question of Ukraine. So you've been obviously extremely hawkish on Western policy in Ukraine. There's a sort of a split on the right in the United States, at least with regard to Ukraine. More isolationist sentiments cropping up on the right. There's some on the left as well. But that's not unusual. The United States has always had a very strong isolationist sentiment because we're geographically incredibly lucky. We're surrounded on two sides by Canada and on the other side by Mexico and on two sides by ocean. So we can basically isolate ourselves over here. We can be autarkic and have all of our resources. We're fine. Like the United States is always in good shape comparatively to the rest of the world because of all of that. However, the case that hawks have made is that if the United States does not continue to fund the Ukraine war, that Russia will end up winning. The converse case, which I think is sort of a moderate peacenik case, moderate dovish case, is one that I've made on occasion and Henry Kissinger has made. And what that is we all know where this is going. We know what the end point of this war is. And the end point of this war is very likely that Russia is going to end up retaining large parts of Crimea, Donetsk, and Luhansk. And everybody knows that that's what the end point here is going to be.
I don't think that's true. I think that would have been the case early on. I think that's when Kissinger was saying this. I'm not sure when he last said this, but nobody expected Ukraine to still be in the battle in the way that they are, or doing as well as they are, or for the Russians to be struggling militarily as they are. And the longer it's gone on, the more I think the Ukrainians, inspired by Zelensky, who's not a perfect individual by any means, he was a former TV producer, comedian, did Dancing with the Stars in Ukraine, and suddenly he's propelled into becoming a wartime president. And reminded me a little bit of Winston Churchill in that sense, where Churchill was a bit of a joke before World War II. Denounced by his party, flip-flop between parties. No one really took him seriously. And then when confronted with the biggest challenge of his lifetime, he rose to that challenge magnificently. That's the way I see Zelensky. But Churchill wasn't perfect either, but he came at the right moment at the right time. So I think the fundamental importance to me of why Ukraine must win is for the reasons that you just articulated. Vladimir Putin wants to restore the Soviet Union. He wants to be a modern-day Tsar, presiding over the once great Soviet Union again. And I think he smelt weakness. I think he looked at what happened with the Afghanistan withdrawal. And I think he thought, no Trump, Biden looks weak, threw the towel in Afghanistan, didn't seem to care. Now's the time to test the Americans. Because the Ukrainians can't do this without America. They could do it without the British, they could do it without the Germans, without the French. But let's be completely clear, you're the number one superpower in the world. You still have, I think, 50% of the world's military hardware. And the Ukrainians need the American support or they can't win. But I think they can win with enough American support. So the question then becomes, why should America keep investing the money? Well, the alternative is you let Putin win. Win being he takes the existing Crimea, which he took in 2014, takes large swathes of the Donbass, and he just takes the land he wants. If that happens, he won't stop there. I'm absolutely certain of it. He didn't stop after Crimea. Why would he stop if he wins another chunk of land of Ukraine? But secondly, when did Americans, and particularly Republicans, when did they actually think it was a good thing that a dictator like Vladimir Putin invaded a democratic country in this way, with such impunity and such a barbaric way, attacking maternity hospitals and so on, and just thought, actually, that's not our concern. It's never been the American way. And I compare it not to the second Iraq war, which was a fiasco fought over a false pretext that Saddam Hussein had weapons of mass destruction, and a false link between him and 9/11 when there wasn't one. But the first Gulf War, when Saddam Hussein invaded Kuwait, who were not a NATO country, and America was right in there with storming Norman, leading the way to kick him out and restore the sovereignty of Kuwait. And I don't remember many Republicans saying that was a terrible thing to do. In fact, quite the opposite. They thought it was a great thing to do, and there was great American pride in the military operation to kick Saddam out of Kuwait. The only difference between that and Ukraine is that, A, it's more important, Ukraine, strategically and geographically, I think. And secondly, Vladimir Putin has nuclear weapons.
Well, it's that second factor that I think is leading a lot of people to take pause, meaning that let's say that he gets the deal that I proposed before, that he comes to the table, he says, I'll cut it out, Ukraine
Why should the Ukrainians give him an inch?
Well, it's not about why the Ukrainians should give him an inch. It's why the United States should back the Ukrainians in not giving him an inch.
Why should the Americans encourage Ukraine to give up an inch?
To avoid the worst scenario, which would be the use of a tactical nuclear weapon.
What would you feel if Vladimir Putin threatened American mainland with nuclear weapons?
Believe me, on an emotional level, I totally understand where Ukrainians are coming from, and I'm rooting for them.
What would you feel then? What would all the American peaceniks at the moment who want to give up the land?
Listen, there's no question.
If he suddenly invaded Montana,
if one missile,
you're saying, oh yeah, we'll give him half of Montana.
If one missile, but the United States is also the most powerful country in the world that's not reliant on anybody else in terms of our own self-defense and preservation. Right. If you're an American, your first question is not how do Ukrainians feel about Ukraine? Your first question is what is in America's interest? And so the argument that I've made is that overall, American foreign policy has been quite Wilsonian in sort of intent for the last century. And that's not been great in a lot of different ways. The sort of idea that should be pursued is that realism in America's interest can coincide with things like military support for Ukraine in order to achieve America's interests. America's interests in Ukraine are, as you mentioned, not allowing dictators to run roughshod over borders, maintaining an American-led sphere of influence that guarantees freedom of waterways, for example, freedom of trade, restraint in terms of military use of force that threatens all the supply lines so we don't end up back in sort of a 2020 situation.
Why would Putin's ability to have this nuclear arsenal change your thinking about how you deal with it?
Because
when did a nuclear deterrent become something that a dictator could use as a stick to threaten people?
Well, I mean, throughout the entire Cold War. I mean, the entire Cold War, the United States didn't go balls to the wall specifically because of that, right?
Why would he launch a nuclear strike?
Well,
knowing it would lead to his immediate evisceration.
If he believes that the alternative is his immediate evisceration, meaning that if he's pushed all the way to the wall, the theory goes.
You think Russian generals would go along with that, knowing that them and all their families immediately die?
Well, I mean, I'm not sure that it's worth the bet. Right? That's the question for America.
Then psychologically, he wins, and he wins big. And then also,
does he though? I mean, if he loses 200,000 troops in Ukraine,
hang on, but here's what
which is what he will lose.
Right, but China look at that, and they've got nuclear weapons, and they go, oh, okay, so all you got to do is threaten to use nuclear weapons, and the Americans back off. The world's biggest superpower with the biggest military will not engage if you threaten them with nuclear weapons. And everyone's got a weapon as a deterrent, turns around and goes, actually, we're going to use them. So what are you going to do about it? But once you blink on this, and I think it's a really fundamental point, it is basically a form of cowardice to say, if somebody threatens to do something, the school bully threatens to punch you in the face, right, and you have the ability to defend yourself, you've got the same weapons that he has, if you allow that bully to win and you back off because you're worried about what he may do to you, everybody loses. And America loses big time. And China looks at it and goes, okay, now we go into Taiwan.
So then the question becomes...
That's my thought process.
I understand. The question becomes, what does the off-ramp look like? Because what the Biden administration has said, as long as it takes, and we don't know what the off-ramp looks like. And the question becomes for Americans, okay, so how long does this go on? We're now seeing some unintended side effects. China is suggesting that they're going to get involved by shipping weapons via Moscow and all of the rest in an obvious attempt to sort of bring this thing to a conclusion and get everybody to the table, because China doesn't like what's happening very much either. It was all fun and games when Russia was becoming a proxy oil state for them. When Russia's actually on the verge of possible collapse, then China starts to worry a little bit more because they're on their border. So the question becomes, what does that off-ramp look like? And does there have to be some off-ramp that allows
I don't think you give him an inch.
So then what is the outcome?
Not an inch of territory. And by the way, every American I know, if I said to them, Vladimir Putin invades any part of the United States and takes an inch of territory and claims it as his own, every American, to a man and woman that I know, would say, absolutely not in a million years, I'd rather die.
So, number one.
In other words, there's a moral inconsistency because that's the Ukrainian position. Why the hell should they give up even 1 inch of their land to this murderous dictator?
The point that I'm making here is that I totally agree with Ukrainians who say they don't want to give up 1 inch of land. I'm just not sure that America has to agree with Ukrainians that what's in America's best interest is not for the Ukrainians to give up 1 inch.
Well, only if America cares about freedom and democracy and saving a sovereign country from being taken over by a Russian dictator.
Well, I mean, they've been saved. Meaning, Ukraine.
Also, you're in it.
Prior to this,
you've already committed $110 billion to this, right? So
yes.
You just say, okay, well, we're just going to write that off and give up.
What do you mean give up? I mean,
that's the alternative.
The original goal for Putin in Ukraine was to take Kyiv. It wasn't to take Luhansk and Donetsk.
Right.
He already had Luhansk and Donetsk.
Why should he get any of it?
What do you mean, why should he get? He had it before this war began.
Why should he be allowed to grab any of it?
To prevent further loss of life, further American expenditure, possible use of tactical nuclear weapons, China getting involved indirectly.
So fear. Well,
I mean, that's always foreign policy.
Huh?
Right?
I don't know, actually, no. Because
any negotiated end. Virtually all wars end with a negotiated end.
World War II, Winston Churchill was encouraged to do exactly this. He was encouraged to basically give up, right? Because the losses would be too great, because the damage that the Nazis would do would be too overwhelming. It wasn't worth it. Do the deal, Winston. Do a deal. Give up. And he absolutely refused to give an inch to the Nazis. And in the end, he managed to make people believe in Britain that we could win. And Zelensky has been doing the same thing with his people. Well, they've gone from a terrified populace to now thinking a year in, you know what, we can win this. And that's an incredibly powerful thing, which we had in the UK back in World War II. And the Americans helped us win that war, obviously, significantly. And Ukraine needs America to step up now and finish the job. And the end game is that Ukraine do not give up an inch. And Putin is seen to lose. I don't think in a moment he's ever going to unleash a nuclear attack on anybody. Because if he did, that's the end of him and Russia and everything he's built up and everything he cares about and his family and all his possessions. He's a very materialistic guy. He's built up a huge personal fortune of yachts and cars and mansions and so on. He's not an Islamic fundamentalist terrorist who is quite happy to lose his life in the cause. He's not that kind of person. So why should we be barreled by fear in the face of this guy simply because he has weapons?
Is that really fear of him as much as it is fear of the unknown? So
I think it's fear of him, yeah.
Well, no,
it's fear of him. He's the guy with the finger on the button.
Not necessarily. I mean, so to quote Kissinger again, one of the things that we can't foresee is what happens if Putin goes down in Russia. Let's say Putin goes down. Who comes next? Right. This is one of the concerns. Is Putin loses?
Could it be a lot worse?
Yes.
Oh, I doubt it.
Yes.
I read that. I doubt that. But again,
I mean, they could lose territorial control of the entire state, and then you have 2,500 nuclear weapons rolling around.
You don't take on the school bully in the playground because there's another. Hang on, let me finish the analogy.
Sure.
There's another big lump in the playground that might come along. It might hit you even harder. No, at some point you've got to give the school bully a smack in the face.
Has he not been given a smack in the face?
No.
He's lost 150,000 troops.
Yeah, but
it's the worst losses they've had since World War II.
He doesn't care about that. Nor does he care about the sanctions, which have been completely ineffective because of the squeeze on energy. He's been able to make a ton of money out of energy. So the sanctions haven't worked at all. And on the battlefield, he's lost a ton of his soldiers, but he doesn't care about that. He's got a ton more. He's got tens of millions more he can bring onto the battlefield. So that's not the way that you deal with someone like Putin. I think the way you deal with him is the way the Americans have been doing, but time to step it up, with the help of the Europeans, by the way. It shouldn't be just America on its own ever. Britain has led the way in Europe, and we should be doing more. Germany should step up more. France should step up more. Concerted effort here now to give Zelensky the air power he's been asking for, to give him more tanks, to give him more firepower, and to actually repel the Russians from Ukraine. And that is the only way you deal with a dictator. And anything that is reductive from that, giving him an inch of new land to steal like he did Crimea, I think is a surrender. And I don't think the Ukrainian spirit would allow that. And I don't think the American spirit has ever been that you give a dictator like Vladimir Putin a win in that way. Why would you?